We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first I have to tell you all about this game-changing product I use before a night out with drinks. It's called ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol. Pre-Alcohol is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly and you'll feel your best tomorrow. I won't lie, I was a bit on the fence about ZBiotics initially, but I gave it a shot and I was impressed with the results. Vacations, weddings, birthdays and reunions, there's so much going on. Get the most out of your summer plans by stocking up on pre-alcohol now. Go to zbiotics.com/race to get 15% off your first order when you use RACE at checkout. Pre-alcohol is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/race and use the code RACE at checkout for 15% off. Thank you, ZBiotics, for sponsoring this episode and our good times.
This episode is brought to you by Honda. When you test drive the all-new Prologue EV, there's a lot that can impress you about it. There's the class-leading passenger space, the clean, thoughtful design, and the intuitive technology. But out of everything, what you'll really love most is that it's a Honda. Visit honda.com/EV to see offers.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar Podcast. We're down to 3 races to go with the Milwaukee Mile coming up this weekend, a double header. But first, we've got Portland to get onto. Alongside me, JR Hildebrand to break down all of the action from that race. In this episode, we'll talk about a Will Power third win of the season, what he had to say about that after the race as well. Of course, beating Alex Palou, who has a fairly healthy margin going into the last 3 races. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion at this point, but he definitely has a nice little lead to play with. Some excellent banter between him and Joseph Newgarden in the post-race press conference that we'll also address. We'll also break down everything that happened in the race, including Santino Ferrucci bagging his first IndyCar pole position. Relatively straightforward race, JR. I did quite enjoy this after what has felt like quite a few races of just kind of like madness, or I guess the oval races always produce that element of strategy, people moving around, and there's always the opportunity for things like restarts to mix up the order. This felt like a proper strategical battle in a proper IndyCar road course kind of way, and although it's very different in terms of like maybe not as much lap by lap combat as you might expect or might hope for from some races, it's at least something for people who really enjoy this kind of racing to get their teeth stuck into and enjoy this kind of aspect of just a different type of racing in IndyCar itself, and something we can celebrate from the basis of, we've got a lot of short ovals, we've got street races, we've got road courses, just a little bit of different flavour to enjoy from the weekend.
Yeah, I think one of my takeaways from the weekend was definitely similar, particularly once you got to the race. You absolutely had to have outright pace to end up in the top 5 in this race. Your team had to execute at an extraordinarily high level, and that really mattered more than because there was no cautions, and because the field generally was quite close together. There was a lot of cars that had enough pace to be in the mix, for, we'll say, podium contention, like at least for third on the podium. Basically all the cars that finished from third down to like 8th or 9th or something, had their races gone a little bit differently. You could pick out any of those drivers and say, okay, well, if they'd have been able to do this or their team had been able to do that at this one particular kind of critical junction in the race, then they could have had themselves in podium contention. But to your point, it really did. Watching the race, you felt like the cream was just rising to the top throughout the entire event, even among the two leaders in Will Power and Alex Palou. It was sort of a chess match between the two of those drivers and their teams throughout the event that you couldn't put a foot wrong. You really had to get everything right to beat the guys around you. Let's just say, this turned out not to be a race. We've seen some races at, Mid-Ohio comes to mind kind of, or some places like that, even Barber, where it's just easy enough to keep cars behind you or something, that you will often see drivers that seem like they've got more than enough pace to drive their way to the front, and then they kind of just stall out and it doesn't really happen. This was, an event where it really felt like the teams and drivers that just executed at the highest level really were the ones that, ended up at the front. And because there was no caution throughout the race, you saw the ebb and flow of that, throughout. So even with that in mind, you kind of saw some of the teams and drivers like adapt to the way that worked out for them earlier in the race better than others towards the end of the race. And I think, I don't, this is not necessarily a good, bad, or otherwise thing, but definitely an event where any mistake did cost you a lot, and so we didn't really see big mistakes from the lead group, guys, even throughout the event that seemed like they were in contention in the top 10. But there were certainly some drivers that were maybe just outside of that needed a bit of a points haul here, or really could have used that completely took themselves out of those situations by making just one error, an error that didn't even end up with you in the tires or something, So I think, to me, it was definitely just exemplary of the level of competitiveness up and down the field in the IndyCar series right now. This was an event that really showcased that.
Romain Grosjean, a fantastic example of what you were just describing there in terms of a small error putting you out of the race. We'll get on to him shortly, but first let's just address that lead battle and the kind of strategic element of that you mentioned as well. Palou said in the post-race press conference that he was expecting before the race that between sort of laps 15 and 30-ish on a stint, you were going to get a really good kind of look at who the teams that had really got the setup right for this race and had really nailed the preparation and making sure that everything was going to work right across the stint. Because if you didn't, you would really get found out in that kind of lap 15 to 30 range. You would fall down the order and really struggle. And that was definitely the case with a lot of cars. And one of the reasons why, as you mentioned, we had the sort of cream rising to the top, because we had the teams that did get it right, were able to really put a gap on some of the people behind them. It was interesting that obviously Power and Palou both started on fresh hard tyres, but then after that the tyre strategies kind of switched about a bit in the following stint. So Palou stayed with hards but went to used, and Power stuck with softs for the rest of the race, the red tyres. He went 2 sets of used and then a fresh set for the last stint. Palou went for the used hards for the second stint, then used his fresh softs in the penultimate stint, and then went to a set of used hards at the end of the race. And that kind of explained the bouncing around of the gap between the two of them, because we had Palou kind of trailing Power a little bit through the middle course of the race there. Once he put his sticker softs on, he was able to bring that gap back in. But I think around that, well, on the last pit stop, basically, Power was able to extend after that, and that was definitely the case, being that Power was on the fresh softs in the last stint there, and Palou was on a set of used hards. And a little bit of strategy even coming into qualifying and deciding what tyres to use in qualifying, what to keep fresh for the race in terms of just planning out your tyres through qualifying as well, turning out to be really important in how this all kind of played out. Those two at the front, definitely the class of the field. Joseph Newgarden pulled off a nice drive to put himself in third, and then just rounding out the top 5, we had Colton Herta, and we'll get on to him in a second, and Marcus Armstrong, who's having a really nice run actually recently in the IndyCar series. He's had a 5th, an 8th and a 5th in the last few races, the 8th at Gateway, and he's very inexperienced because he didn't do the ovals last season. So he's having a nice little run there with Ganassi at a time where it's going to be very important for his future and all of the Ganassi drivers' futures to stay kind of in the limelight and doing a good job, I guess, just making sure that they're up there and performing well. Let's start with Herta's kind of. There's kind of so many different places to go with this race. Why don't we stick with the start and the Dixon Fittipaldi incident? Where did you kind of lie on the way that was judged? If you've not seen it, basically Dixon started pretty high up, but was kind of bumped wide by Kyle Kirkwood at turn 5. The right-hander was kind of bumped off there, and then he came back onto the track and was trying to get back up to speed. He was obviously slow, and a few cars behind were avoiding him. Fittipaldi went to the inside there where there's a curb that you would never use normally, so it's a bit difficult to judge a driver and kind of blame him for how his car reacted over that curb when drivers never use it anyway. But at the same time, Dixon didn't really have a lot of room to go on the left-hand side there. I think I would be... Obviously, Race Control's been in the spotlight for a little while now, and if you've not... if you didn't listen to last week's episode, I would recommend you go back and catch up on Gateway and how Race Control kind of put itself in the spotlight in that race. Again, some interesting decisions in this race, and I thought that was one of them. That felt like more of a racing incident to me, but I'm not sure if you feel differently on that one, JR, or if you had any kind of extra insight to add to that one.
I basically think the start of that with Kirkwood, sort of diving down the inside, I think it's into turn 6, I think is the right-hander there.
Yeah.
I guess, unfortunately, that's just a move that we've seen sort of time and time again over the last few years that's been allowed, in essence, to just use up the track at the exit there. I guess I sort of think that Race Control needs to change their positioning on that in order for preemptively, basically, like going into the race next year, they'd need to say, say at the drivers' meeting, okay, we're going to police this differently. If you're side by side at the apex, you have to leave the car room there at the exit in order for that to change, because otherwise guys have just seen it happen enough, and that it sort of has almost, I feel like that corner in essence has set the precedent for how they address that type of incident. A lot of other road courses, we've seen the same type of thing occur at Road America and some other places that have corners where you might end up in a similar scenario. And so that, I think, is what happened to Dixon there is sort of just par for the course. Unfortunately, given I can see where he'd be pissed off about it, no question about it. Like he in his interview, he very clearly was pointing to that as being the thing that needed to be addressed. There was no contact between the two of them, and Race Control basically has let that go at Portland, specifically in that corner, for the last several years. So that I think to Scott's point, that is really where this whole thing originates. That's probably what needs to get looked at more closely. To your point, the actual incident with Pietro, I thought that was an undeserved penalty, just because basically if you're Pietro, Scott's not giving you enough room to go anywhere around that curb. So from Scott's perspective, he probably doesn't know that Pietro is right there. He's giving him some room. He left basically half a car width more than you normally would, because normally you would track out in essence right over to that the curbing there. It's just kind of it's a weird curb that in some respects probably doesn't need to be there. I think it's in essence just to protect you from having an incidental collision into that hard just K-wall there. So it's sort of just it's in essence, I think, there just to detract you from squeezing up against that K-wall and kind of misjudging cars coming around that. It almost seems like it's probably more for bigger cars, like an Indy car is, you're not hurting to figure out how to not use up that space. Maybe in like a stock car or something, you'd be more inclined to be using more of that road or whatever, just threading the needle onto the straightaway there. But the reality of it was, for Pietro, he just had nowhere to go, ended up just center punching that curb, and he's a total passenger then, as is Dixon at that point. So I'd be interested, I guess, to hear from Race Control. This is again why I think IndyCar could use something more like you have in the NBA or something, where just give us a little, synopsis of why the calls were made when they are these sort of judgment-based calls. It'd be really interesting after the race just to have a quick rundown from Race Control. Is like, here's why we decided this was avoidable. Because I think I was watching it feeling like I'm having a hard time figuring out what the expectation here for Pietro was. Like his only real option to avoid that was literally to like get on the brakes in the middle of the straightaway in the middle of like fourth gear or something to not get squeezed. And so I don't know, that seems just kind of over the top in terms of what you could expect somebody to do there. So I would at best chalk it up to a racing incident for sure.
And it was the start of the race. So if he does smash on the brakes there, at full acceleration on a straight, he's going to get hit from behind.
Yeah.
I think in an isolated scenario midway through the race where the pack is more spread out and Fittipaldi hasn't sort of dropped out of that, then I could understand a little bit more of the blame being apportioned to him. But at the start of the race there, like Pietro's choices are to launch himself over that curb or to smash on the brakes and get hit from behind by someone. So I struggled to work out, like you did, work out where the line was there. And I think I've talked about this a million times on the podcast before. We do need those documents that Formula One has where they give it, like you said, in the NBA, give a synopsis of the reasons why they make a decision. I think race control should be held to account for the decisions that it makes, like any sort of governing body should be from just an outside perspective. But that's not, I don't think that even needs to be the primary reason that you do it. I think it just gives people an understanding of why decisions are being made, because obviously the drivers have the drivers meeting, they can discuss things with IndyCar themselves, and people like me, journalists, can contact IndyCar and ask them to explain decisions they've made in race control, and they generally will. It's very rare. In fact, I don't think it's ever happened to me where they've not, given me an answer as to why something's been decided in the way it has. But how does that then trickle down to the fans and to the people, watching at home? I'd love every single IndyCar fan to read all of my articles or to listen to every one of our podcasts, but that's not a way to, get that information across, and it's not a way to document it. So I'd love to see that as well. I was interested in just kind of while I mentioned F1, obviously there's like a kind of understanding, or at least elements of the rules. It's a little bit blurred lines, but there's usually something that dictates whether, if you push someone off the track, even if you've not touched them, then you can be deemed a penalty for that. And that was quite high profile in this race as well, that we had with Romain Grosjean and Colton Herta, because I don't think they actually touched. They got very close to touching, but all of that was caused in a bottleneck by Joseph Newgarden coming out of the pits. Grosjean had to check up, and then it looked like he missed a gear or something. Like he'd slowed down so much. I don't know if that was the case and that's what happened, but he was obviously trying to avoid Joseph and not get into the back of him, slowed really extensively, and then Colton had to fly to the left to get out of the way, and then Roman just, I think, didn't see him and kind of just pushed him off the track. And I understand there was some people on social media saying, well, if you haven't penalised Kirkwood for pushing Dixon off at turn 6, and you can't punish Roman for pushing Colton off there either. And I wonder if we need some sort of something either in the rules or something that's communicated to the drivers, or just like a more strict way of policing this kind of thing, because even if there's not been contact there, that has had a significant impact on both of the drivers who were involved. It's had a massive impact on their races, and it wasn't, those incidents weren't their fault. What did you think of the Herta and Grosjean one?
I looked at that one quite differently, which I think was just that Herta, I guess I feel like that was on, it's sort of Colton's problem to deal with, that he ended up off the track there, basically. Like, it's not, I don't say it's his fault. I think it's just sort of a weird jam up that occurred, basically, that if Colton is Colton's in the car, he's like, I've got this huge head of steam. You have two choices. One is, I'm going to keep on the wood and like keep banging gears and shoot this gap that is unquestionably going to close up on you. Like, you got to assume that Roma is like, doesn't know where you're at, basically, at that point. I think, like, maybe you've got a spotter in your ear, maybe not, but he's having his own issue to deal with. Personally, I wasn't watching that thinking it's Roma's problem to deal with at this point, to like figure out where a car that's like 2 gears up on him at this point is going to go to pass him. Like, he probably, all things being equal, would like to keep that car from going by, but he just stayed on the racing line basically through through the exit of 2 there, basically. So that is a gap that is going to close if that car stays on the racing line. The closing speed was so immense at that point between Colton and, like, to me, I kind of I watched Colton fire it off and sort of thought, well, it was either that or he also checked way up and tried the over under on him, assuming Romain like follows that trajectory to the outside of the track. He had to, Colton just ended up with like bad timing there to check up sooner and like get to use that momentum to carry him to the inside, or at least wait until Romain exits all the way over to driver's left and then can choose or not to like proactively block to the inside or something. But that to me looked more like, okay, well, yeah, that was going to be a gap that was going to close up on driver's left. And so it just didn't, you're sort of you're relying on Romain to know you're there and choose not to close that gap on you, basically. Like, I think that's the following driver's responsibility to like figure out how to judge that, not the driver in the lead, or the driver that's ahead, particularly given that the gap's going to close if he just stays on the racing line. So it's not his responsibility. It's not like he's blocking Colton because he's just staying on the racing line doing it, basically. And I guess I just felt like those scenarios were actually quite different in terms of like what you frequently see happening in turn 6 and on the exit there is, I'm just going to use up I'm going to use you up on the exit of the road here because we're next to each other, basically. Like, that there's a pass that's occurring. This was like momentary chaos because everything's gotten screwed up and Romain's like in damage control mode, so the idea that he just continued along on the racing line, I think if you could see Romain's onboard, I think you'd probably see like, oh, he just, whether he knew he was there or not, he certainly wasn't entirely aware of like the entire situation, the way that it was unfolding at that point, for sure.
There's definitely nuances between the Kirkwood Dixon thing and the Herta Grosjean thing being different, and that our 2 takes on that incident are proof of why it's so difficult for race control to decide either how to police something or how to write it into the rules. I guess it's just such a, like, when people have got different opinions on something, it's really hard to know how to come to the middle and decide on that, isn't it? It's why, we're happy to criticize decisions that we see that are objectively incorrect or don't appear to follow a set of rules or break a precedent or don't appear to go in the way that we think that they should do. But you also have to give a lot of credit to them for dealing with just something that is a subjective subject matter, basically.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add that I think just broadly is something that probably, if we're going to get into the business of sort of reconsidering the way that some of these things end up working out and thinking about the way that they're policed in order to set a different type of precedent or something down the road, one of the things that definitely comes to mind and I guess is probably why I think, or is at the root of why I think these 2 incidents are rather different, even if you were to more seriously police these types of things going forward, is that ultimately I think it's the pass. We have to start with, it's the car that's making the pass. It's their responsibility to like complete the pass, in essence. And so if you applied that in these kinds of scenarios, then it's Kirkwood passing on the inside of Scott Dixon, in turn 6. So if you're putting the onus on him to make that move, then that's saying, well, then you have to leave the other car room, at the exit of the track. In the other scenario, it's kind of like it's Colton Herta like trying to blast around the outside offline, basically, of Romain Grosjean. So that's, I think, why I look at those 2 things a little bit differently. That the Kirkwood Grosjean situation would be more like if the roles were flip-flopped and you're trying an outside pass around somebody into turn 6, that it's kind of like, okay, well, of course you're not gonna, that's like a low percentage move just to start with. because you're not going to have the apex. You're not outbraking. You're not going to outbrake that guy. You're not, you're not in the dominant position going through the corner. And so, so that's going to be a situation where like probably you got to just get out of the way, I think that's sort of why I looked at those two things. But I would just say that broadly about all of these things that we've seen over the years, that there have definitely been a number of, exactly to your general point here, and why I think fans are probably, there's gray area to be confused by the way that these things end up working out, is just because I think we haven't seen enough onus being applied to the car that is making the move here, just regardless. Over the last few years, we've definitely seen some instances. I mean, I still sort of go back to Rossi and Rosenquist at Toronto last year. I think that it was just kind of like, what? Like, he just drove into his side pod, basically. Like, that was nowhere near being a completed pass, and it was a huge lunge from way back. The only reason there was any room there is because the car that was at risk of getting past tried to leave enough room so that they didn't both crash, basically. And so that to me was almost the kickoff of this whole thing that we continue to revisit, is like, all right, well, that's leaving the door wide open for there being just too much gray area here in terms of the way that these, or sort of too much room for interpretation, basically, in terms of what's going to be allowed and what's not. At a lot of tracks in a lot of different situations.
And just for anyone who doesn't remember that incident, they can go back and look it up. But there was no further action taken in that incident. It was no penalty, and they were fighting for a top 5 at that point. So not that it's any less important to be fighting for like 22nd or something. Like, we're not talking about an insignificant battle for a serious position here with two drivers who. It was 22, wasn't it? And at the time, they were both fighting for their respective sort of futures and working out what they, how their futures were going to play out. So that was a really significant move.
We love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn, and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit-card.
Time now to tell you about the sponsor of this episode, Grammarly. Do you struggle with when to use fewer instead of less? Do you find yourself writing important emails which, when you look back on them, take far too long to get to the point? Are you guilty of exclamation marks and too much jargon? Well, Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you find the words you need and the right text for your context. It learns your personal style and your brand or company style to give you personalised suggestions based on what you're writing and who's going to read it. Grammarly works across all the apps and sites you use, like Word, Google Docs, Pages, Slack, and more, so there's no need to copy and paste. Grammarly works where you work. Smart features like tone suggestions help you navigate even the most difficult work conversations. And what's more, data privacy and security are woven into the foundations of Grammarly. It's the gold standard of responsible AI, with 15 years of best-in-class communication, trusted by tens of millions of professionals and IT departments. So get AI writing support that works where you work. Download Grammarly for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Grammarly. Easier said, done.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
All right, I don't want to go without mentioning it, but I do want to leave this for the next episode, and that's to chat about Colton Herta's repositioning penalty as well that he got he used the hybrid to restart his engine in his final pit stop, and then was given a penalty for that because it's not allowed. Colton admitted after the race that he didn't realise that wasn't allowed, and that's the reason why he did it. But then in terms of the penalty, he was moved back a place on track, but instead of being, it's usually a position in the classification that you moved back, and instead he was moved a car back. So he just went behind Pietro Fittipaldi, who was laps down at this point. So there didn't appear to be any penalty for Colton Herta in this sense, in terms of a positional sense. I have asked IndyCar about this and waiting to hear a response back, so that's why we'll leave that one and pick it up after Milwaukee, just to address what had happened there. But I didn't want to go without mentioning it, just because it was quite a significant moment in the race, and I'm sure there'll be drivers like, well, Marcus Armstrong in fifth, maybe thinking he should have been fourth because of how that all played out and didn't get it. So we'll get some reasoning on that and try and work out what happened there. Another major storyline, Joel, was Santino Ferrucci scoring pole position for Foyt. Amazing, like, kind of end of two 10-year stories. Santino Ferrucci's last single-seater pole came basically in 2014. At the same time as Foyt's last pole with Sato, and this kind of 10-year cycle coming to an end, which was really interesting. I wonder if you could just give a little bit of insight into sort of your time at this team, and kind of to see them from what you saw even then, which wasn't that long ago, to now being able to score a pole position in the IndyCar series. And let's just say, by the way, that it wasn't, this was against Will Power, who scored more poles than anybody else in IndyCar history. You've got Alex Palou up there. You've got a host of drivers who are either, fighting for very significant positions this year in the championship, or are just very accepted, very good qualifiers in the IndyCar series. And Foyt managed to put themselves up there. A track they've not been, it's not like a track you would think that you would circle at the start of the year and say, all right, when Foyt gets to Portland, they're going to be amazing. Like, that's not something you would do at the start of the year. Obviously, the Penske link has given them, a lot of onus this season, and a lot of ability to push forward. A lot of personnel coming in and changes there, even from when you were there. I know even Santino's even got a Penske race engineer this year, with James Schnabel coming in, who's worked on Joseph Newgarden's car on ovals, for example, in Penske's team. You've got all sorts of people in there, haven't you, who've got some amazing experience. Obviously, Michael Cannon's the big one, the technical director, the person that people always talk about, Scott Dixon's engineer for a little while there, and he goes back to like players and a long time ago in the IndyCar series, and prior to that, obviously people who've come over with Cannon as well. Just a real mix of people in there, and doing something that other teams would struggle to do, I think. I mean, it was interesting to me, and you don't have to address it in this sense. We'll return to the original question of just your feeling of how far the team's come. But it wasn't lost on me that this was a weekend where McLaren had a really difficult weekend as one of the Chevrolet teams. Judging by where Grosjean was, Juncos, Foyt, obviously Penske, all ahead of McLaren in the Chevrolet kind of pecking order of things. And that's a team that has invested, an enormous amount of money over a sustained period of multiple years now to try and get onto the same level as Penske, Ganassi and Andretti. And yet, Foyt have been able to do this, take this massive leap forward with obviously a lot of help from Penske and some of the personnel that they've brought in. But it just feels like a really significant achievement that we should kind of mark, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that you have to give Larry Foyt a lot of credit for basically, I think broadly just assessing, like, where does performance come from in the IndyCar series, and how are the teams that are doing that on their own achieving it, and what are the ways that you can close that gap to zero? And then what are the other ways that you can just get really close without having to do all those same things? I mean, we had Gavin Ward on the pod at the beginning of this year. And so I think that's an interesting insight into, we're going to do this all on our own. Probably because you have to, right? Like, nobody's Penske, Ganassi, I guess throw Andretti in there. They're not going to do a technical deal with McLaren. So they have to do it on their own. They're sitting there like, well, shit, maybe we need a wind tunnel. Maybe we need a tunnel inside of a mountain, to be able to like do the things that Ganassi does. That's a big gap to close that if you got to do it on your own is like insurmountable in a short period of time. In essence, that was kind of the vibe that I got from Gavin, that he was like, we can do a lot of things to get close, there's these handful of things that in order to actually make that gap zero in terms of our competitive difference, it's a long process that is not just throwing dollars at stuff or people for that matter. If you're in Larry's kind of position here, you are going to have some options on the table to do partnerships or do deals. And so obviously that's the sort of actually the second part of this. The first part of this is how can we just quickly get really close to shoring up some big gaps? And that was hiring Cannon and a couple other guys, one other guy in particular from Ganassi, basically just to get their 500 program much closer to being competitive. And so you just instantly overnight get a bunch of quick tips and tricks to make that better, which comes down to equipment and knowledge that potentially anybody could have or have access to, that you don't need a tunnel in the side of a mountain, to go.
It's Rick Pearson, isn't it? Rick Pearson, they brought over from Ganassi to work on the gearboxes and stuff like that. He was the other guy I was desperately searching for his name while I was talking about Cannon earlier to mention.
So, some of those things, if you don't have the tunnel in the side of the mountain, if you don't have all of the process-based resources to continue to develop those things, you might get a huge gap and then you kind of slowly fall off, and then you have to do something again to close that bigger gap up. To sort of Mike Cannon and Rick Pearson, without being at Ganassi, may not be continuing to evolve their own processes as quickly as they would have if they had stayed at Ganassi, because they just don't have access to all the same resources. But you can kind of take these big leaps, and you see that occurring throughout the paddock. We've heard this from a number of folks, you get a team like Ganassi, a big team like Ganassi, but one who maybe doesn't have the ability that Penske has to keep people there, to overpay people just to keep them there. You do end up with Cannon, Cowden, these guys that know a lot of Ganassi's sort of tricks, just spreading out and ending up at other teams. And so you end up with that, data bank kind of getting spread out across these other places. So that's one thing that I think Larry has just rightly identified as a mechanism for, making this happen, or elevating the team. It's not for lack of having really good people there. It's just, okay, we are in our own closed loop environment that we don't have access to the types of resources required to figure out where some of these next steps are. So we need just an injection of those next steps to reset our baseline. So that's what Cannon and Rick showing up, suffice to do. That's kind of take Cannon also just being a great engineer out of it. The added benefit is that you've got Mike Cannon, who is historically a great engineer. And so he is somebody you're going to get a lot of just upside out of that weekend to weekend. Also, I look at Mike. I worked with Mike for half a season in my rookie year. He was with Panther. They brought him on kind of late in the year. We worked together for a few races, and then we unfortunately didn't continue to work together that following year. I actually never really got the rundown on why that didn't occur. But even at that time, it was clear that Mike is one of these old school engineers. He is maybe the only engineer in the paddock still that doesn't have a college degree.
Wow.
I'm not 100% sure that that's true, but maybe. And Mike, if that's not true, then, then my bad. I heard that from somebody recently. It surprised me a little bit, but also totally jives with the way that what he's like to work with. He's one of these guys that has driven a race car. I think of him and maybe Chris Simmons, of sort of different generations, but as similar guys, that it's they just come with a natural instinct for kind of broadly how things should be. They've got a good spidey sense for when something fundamental is just wrong with the car, and so they are instinctually, I think, really well equipped to look at a situation and go, okay, well, basically this stuff's right and basically that stuff's wrong. So let's just get everything kind of into the window, and that we've heard this from a number of teams and engineers over the last few years. If you can kind of just get everything in the window, then you've got a puncher's chance at showing up anywhere and being quite competitive. Like as long as you're kind of close on the mechanical package, you're close with the dampers, you're not. There's a lot of teams that get outside of that window by like overcomplicating things in the IndyCar series. There's a lot of things that you can still overcomplicate. And if you overcomplicate any one of those things, you overcomplicate your your damper program, like you will have no idea what the hell is going on if you're off pace showing up to a race weekend, or if things don't jive with the sim or whatever. And so Canon, I think, is really good at just reining everything in and saying like, look, we're at least not going to be terrible if we can kind of work with this package. And like the car is fundamentally going to work. It's going to be sensitive to adjustments. It's going to like roughly do the things we think it's going to do, so that when we show up at the track and we have ambient conditions and we have a track condition and we have these other factors that you then react against, we're going to be able to tweak on the car to react against those things. And we're going to get out of it what we think we're going to get out of it once we start doing that. That then still leaves without the tunnel in the side of the mountain and without the other resources that, Penske and Ganassi have that they're throwing at damper programs and all this kind of stuff, that still leaves like an optimization gap that you probably will still have to close, even with Mike Cannon there. Mike is not also going to run a damper program that, like you need extra resources to be able to kind of continue to elevate those other aspects of just overall performance. No lead engineer is sort of doing all of those things, or technical director or whatever. And so that's where this Penske relationship comes into play, and why the combination of these two things. It's no surprise to me that they had a shot at sitting on the Indianapolis 500 pole last year, with just Cannon there. And then coming into this year, you've seen just elevated performance over the course of the season. And now finally that resulting in a totally deserved and legitimate pole position, on a road course here, which is, you just take the uncertainty of the damper program. You immediately just add in the best stuff that can completely close up that gap. Coming from Penske, I think the thing that you kind of have to look at here is, maybe why is it not like that weekend to weekend? There's a bunch of reasons why it might not be like that weekend to weekend. We heard a little bit of it trickling through this weekend, which is just that Santino's, driving style he's having to make some adjustments. You're also going to go through a period of time where you've got Cannon there for a reason. He feels like he's just naturally, anybody in that position is going to feel like they are there for a reason, which is to bring their best to this team. That is naturally at times going to be at odds with the fact that you have all of this stuff from Penske. Cannon basically was coming off of championship winning form at Ganassi, beating the Penske guys. So there's probably a little bit of, why are they not right on Penske one way or the other weekend to weekend? That is, well, they're probably not just running a carbon copy of Joseph Newgarden, Will Power, or Scott McLaughlin's setups weekend to weekend, because they want to try to find their own ways. If I'm Mike Cannon, I'm probably sitting there like, well, okay, great, I have these setups. How can we make these setups even better? And so you're going to be doing some experimenting along the way in the first full season, working with having access to all of that kind of information. So I guess to me, it's this weekend, you basically just saw all of those things come together. They had setups from Penske and they had all the stuff to put behind those setups. It's a little bit like Shank and the Andretti cars. The Shank cars have been ultra quick everywhere that you've seen the Andretti cars be quick this year. It's kind of for all the same set of reasons. Then they also have cannon there and influencing, rightfully so, an ability to even take that and say, oh, well, I've got this different perspective that has also been really successful in its own right at, getting performance out of a baseline setup or whatever of somebody else's. Sometimes tweaking around and experimenting with that will make you a tenth or two slower because you haven't really figured it out. Every once in a while, it'll make you a tenth or two faster. And so, really, I think what this all comes down to that does need to be pointed out is that you still need the nut between the seat and the steering wheel to go out there and rip the lap. And Santino did it twice in that fast six session. To be able to put the thing on top in an ultra tight qualifying session that everybody hadn't had the chance, necessary. I think you sort of would look at McLaughlin as the one guy that basically wasn't there, like wasn't in the fast six, to sort of defend the pace that he had throughout practice. But it's a totally legitimate haul to get that thing on the front row and to stick it on the pole. And like I said, he backed it up with another lap that was right there. So, for me, having had the experience inside Foyt, getting to know Larry Foyt really well, you obviously there's a little bit of it that you kind of want to see the Foyt name for AJ's sake to be competitive in the IndyCar series. Like I think it does carry some weight for the team to be good, but seeing when you're at these kind of smaller teams and you see a little bit of just the struggle that, man, you're doing so many things, you're stretching yourself so thin to find performance. When I was there, the first year that I was there, it's like Bourdais, you've got a total A-list guy that's, and you're kind of sitting in the debriefs and you're watching this all go down and you're like, this is showcasing the other side of the IndyCar series, the competitiveness of the IndyCar series, which is like, you've got a lot of really good people here that are making really good decisions, and they're not like, nobody's screwing this up weekend to weekend. And you're walking away just having to find confidence and a continued drive and ambition out of like maybe qualifying 10th. And that being like you extracting kind of everything there was to extract, and then just absolutely racking your brains to stay the 10th fastest car going into the race, to not lose pace basically from through the one extra session that you've got to the race, to keep up with the decision making that other teams are making. Like it's, the kind of midfield is just, there's a lot of teams and drivers that are in essence, given what they have, executing at just as high a stress level, just as high a, execution level, kind of given where they're at as the teams that are at the front. And they just don't have these things that now Foyt has, as kind of the example of one of those teams that has gotten that stuff. And now suddenly you see the benefits that it reaps. I credit a lot of that to Larry being able to sort of take advantage of what's been available to him to put the team in that position.
I can confirm that Michael Cannon doesn't have a college education, because we spoke about it during an interview that we did last year at the 500. But
okay, good. I'm glad I didn't just like totally throw him under the bus.
You're on a bit of a roll there. I didn't want to interrupt, but also I can't confirm that every other engineer in the paddock has a degree, like from a proving that wrong perspective. So I can't definitely say that sure, what you said is true, but I can tell you that Mike Cannon doesn't have a degree, because he'd left to try and be a racing car driver. So that's, he'd something that you'll identify with, I'm sure, in terms of his decision making. Yeah. And it worked out well for both of you, so that's great. For more on Santino's pole and all of the kind of stuff that's been happening in the background at AJ Foyt Racing, or at least some of it as well, I can't profess to have documented all of it. You can read a feature on the-race.com, which should bring you up to speed and highlight some of those key things that they've done, some of the things that they're benefiting from, some of the areas where this might be repeatable, some of the areas where they've still got a bit of work to do, all that kind of good stuff. So you can head over to the-race.com, as I said, and check that out. There's also a feature over there on Romain Grosjean. If you saw his race, you'll be, I'm sure, interested to read a feature a little bit more detail about how that went, and also a little bit about his situation, where he kind of stands in terms of his future and just where the season has been generally for him. It's been a kind of a weird year that's had so many peaks, but quite a few, I guess, troughs in that sense as well. A lot not his fault, some his fault. We'll get into those in a lot of detail in that feature over on the race, so you can go and check that out. Joe, I'm conscious of time, but before we do go, I wanted to ask you about Milwaukee, because we're heading there this weekend. Can you give fans maybe, let's just say, a couple of like key points of things that we should be watching from this race? It looks, at least from the pictures, that elements of it have been resurfaced, and we have a highline practice scheduled for the Friday, so we'll keep a close eye on how this sort of race is going to play out. I'm cautioned by what we were told before Gateway in terms of like the race was going to be super difficult with no passing and all that kind of stuff. And we got a really good race in the end with the package that we had. So we'll see how all that plays out. But maybe you could just give us a little bit of a hint as to things to look for from Milwaukee.
Milwaukee was always an interesting track in that basically the bottom lane through the corners was a pavement profile, or was a pavement like aggregate that was darker, like a darker pavement that basically, just depending on track temperature, was either grippy or not so grippy. And that the transition between those two things often sort of dictated a little bit of how the racing worked. I say all of that basically to say that the way that the racing used to be at Milwaukee was such that the preferred line typically was like maybe just a half of an inside tire on the sort of edge of the inside line. So basically the second lane, in essence, was like the preferred lane, which made it so that inside and at the inside line, it was never like having the PJ1 or something. Like the inside line was only worse by just enough that you like wouldn't qualify on it, but it was good enough that if you had a little bit of a tire, like if you were on new tires and you were racing somebody that had old tires, you'd go to the bottom and most times be able to use that at a bare minimum to stay out of the direct arrow wake of the car in front of you. And so kind of however that ends up, I guess, looking and working this year, it's very possible that a second lane, I think I kind of just in the fact that you're not going to be flat through the corner, like one way or the other. I don't think the cars have enough downforce basically for you to be flat out, one way or the other. I wouldn't expect even in qualifying that it would be like that. Like you'll be lifting. And so in those kinds of situations, I feel like the tendency is for kind of the a bit like it did, if nothing else, a bit like it did at Gateway, where it starts to creep up and move up, and just for the sake of being able to get some clean air, whether that's using the bottom or using the top to get a little bit of clean air when you're running right in traffic with other cars, the corner radius is tight enough that tends to be something that becomes advantageous enough that once you get into a race with a lot of cars in it, you'll just see that start to materialize. So that would be my hope, at least, not having actually seen where it's been repaved. Otherwise it's, it's a good track for Indy cars. There's going to be a lot of cars on track, which the last couple of times that we were there, it was not, quite like this. So that being kind of having some stack up like you've seen in the last few events, assuming that it doesn't turn into a kind of fuel economy game, can definitely make the races. I think the races being shorter, it's kind of tends to make it less likely that it's a, fuel conservation situation. I mean, the only feedback kind of I've gotten or we've gotten is that the Penske's were just wicked fast at the test. So, I guess we'll sort of be waiting to see if that does truly unfold, or if anybody else has managed to, close that gap heading into the race weekend. But that would be my take on heading to the Milwaukee Mile.
I think a lot of the work that was done on the track was done for NASCAR when that went back in 23. I don't think there's been a whole lot of stuff done, in anticipation of IndyCar going, at least in terms of the road, like the track surface anyway. I know you can go back and listen to the Pato Award episode that we did a little bit earlier in the year, because that's what JR is referring to. It was Pato who said that if the Milwaukee test played out on the race, he said that Penske would be 1, 2, 3 and the rest of the field would be a lap down. So it doesn't give you a lot of hope for that race. But also it wasn't that, I don't think that was a full field test, and I don't think Ganassi were at that test, the one that he was referring to. So we can hold a little bit of hope out that Ganassi might be somewhere in the region of them being there. And I did grab a quote from Will Power just after the hybrid test that happened at Milwaukee a little bit earlier this year, where he said it hasn't changed much. I think those patches don't seem to have much grip through in the middle of the corners, which is really good for passing. He said it's the same track and it feels exactly like it did. So that's good news. If any of those, maybe resurfacing is not the right word to use in terms of just what they've done to the track, but just like repairs and little bits of just polishing the place up a little bit to make it, ready for racing. So we'll keep a close eye on that. It's obviously 3 races to go. We've got Alex Palou leading the championship by 54 points. His gap eaten into a little bit by Will Power, who came into, it was Colton Herta who was second coming into Portland in the championship. So Will Power's usurped Colton Herta, and judging by what Pato Award says, has a very good chance of a strong finish at Milwaukee. It's a double header, don't forget. So it's basically like a double points weekend in one aspect. So that's going to have a massive impact on how the championship plays out. I did promise you that there was some amazing banter between Alex Palou and Joseph Newgarden in the press conference, which was that both of the drivers kind of asked about in indirect ways, kind of Penske's likely or Power's likely chances of finishing ahead on ovals, and also Palou's this kind of I guess view that Palou maybe is lacking something compared to Power in terms of his oval performances, and Joseph answered the question saying that like in a really facetious way, that Alex Palou is in all sorts of trouble in the championship, that he was going to be really worried coming into Milwaukee and all this sort of stuff. And it took Alex Palou a little minute to like twig what Joseph was doing, and then Alex threw in there himself. He said, I'm so scared, I might even not come to Milwaukee, I'm so scared. So that was a great little bit of back and forth banter between those two. And also there was a really complicated attempt by Patrick Steffen to one of the journalists in the IndyCar paddock to explain what the hate cauldron was to Alex Palou, because he was trying to ask him a question about the hate cauldron. If you don't know what that is, it's usually brought in at the start of an IndyCar broadcast where Townsend Bell and James Hinchcliffe put like the t-shirts of 2 drivers who are feuding in the paddock in the hate cauldron, and basically use that as an excuse to talk about the feuds and stuff. And Palou basically said, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but he was like, I've already got enough of my own stuff going on. I don't need to worry about feuding with other drivers. I guess he didn't actually say it in as many words, but hinting that he was talking about his ongoing court case with McLaren in the background. So he's basically saying, I've got my own issues to deal with. I don't need to worry about feuding with any other drivers, which was another bit of brilliant self-awareness and a sign of how confident and comfortable Alex Palou seems to be in the IndyCar series at the moment.
I'm just curious if there's if you have any insight into, we've seen some rumblings of Palou being in the mix for the Sauber / Audi F1 seat. Is that like a real thing, you think?
It's not something that's being treated seriously in the Formula One paddock at the moment, I can tell you that. We did at the race break the story earlier in the year that it emerged from Alex Palou's court documents that he has a clause in his Ganassi contract that he can leave Ganassi for a Formula One team in 2025. So he's contractually able to get out of his Ganassi contract to go to Formula One in 2025 if he was to receive an offer. And we have to say as well, assuming that there's no other kind of additional clauses in the contract that we haven't seen, but the stuff we have seen in the court case says that Alex could potentially be able to leave and get out of his contract for 2025. But the Alfa Romeo story that kind of came out, we couldn't get to the source of that or where that had come from in terms of any reputable source from the base of that, other than people speculating or talking about him in a more like, if you were going to sign someone, he might be someone you want to sign kind of way, not that Alfa Romeo are particularly taking him seriously at the moment. But I think with the situation Alex Palou has been in over the past few years in IndyCar with his contracts, I'd be surprised if a Formula One team came in for him at this moment. But every year he seems to be, strengthening his legacy in IndyCar, doesn't he? And again, this year we've now finished the road courses for the season, and his average finish was 2.5 across 6 or 7 races. So
not insane.
Yeah, just an absolute crush of the field in that sense. 6 races, and the next best person was Will Power with an average finish of 4. So Willie P's not been too bad either. But to have an average rating of anything on any group of tracks for 2.5 to me is just, you're in Max Verstappen sort of Lando Norris territory in a championship which favours 1 or 2 cars basically winning all of the races, whereas here we've got, I think you could make an argument that on any given weekend there's at least 10 cars that can win an IndyCar race, and at some tracks and some events you could push that number out quite significantly depending on circumstances and what happens over the course of the weekend, couldn't you? So incredible statistics, and I'm sure let's just say I'm sure it's not the end of Alex Palou being linked to Formula One, and that'll come up again in the future, especially with that clause being in his contract. JL, thanks for joining me. It's been great to get your insight on Portland and Milwaukee as well. We're definitely looking forward to that coming back onto the calendar and seeing how it races in the series. And when I speak to you next week, we'll only have 1 race in the IndyCar season to go, which it's going to be amazing to think back when we get to that podcast how much has changed in just 1 weekend, because something tells me that doubleheader is going to be pretty significant, not just for the lead of the IndyCar Championship, but also the Leaders Circle, which is so important to so many teams as well. The top 22 teams getting $1 million or almost $1 million towards their finish in the championship. So we'll keep an eye on that. That's all for this week's episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast.
The Athletic.